It's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for Season 8 of The Walking Dead. In this video, we're going to be looking back at the latest news regarding the crossover between Fear the Walking Dead and The Walking Dead, and we're going to discuss how is this character going to cross over from The Walking Dead to Fear the Walking Dead. So at this point, you've all heard about this crossover that's going to be happening between The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. So Morgan Jones from The Walking Dead will be basically crossing over into the other show, into the companion show, Fear the Walking Dead. Now, this is an extremely odd choice, in my opinion. It just doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of both story and also the time aspect of things. Now, I already did like a very long video last time talking about just my thoughts overall and some of the ideas that I had in terms of how it would happen. And after sleeping on it a bit, I actually came up with 3 solid scenarios in which this could go. So there's actually only 3 ways that this crossover could happen in a realistic fashion. Now, before I get into these 3 scenarios, I want to bring something up that is very interesting in my opinion. So a news came out a couple months ago regarding some of the writers and producers at Fear the Walking Dead being changed for Season 4, which is going to be the next season of Fear. And based on that news, one of the producers or co-producers of Season 4 of Fear the Walking Dead was going to be Scott M. Gimple, who's obviously the main showrunner, main producer from the original show, from The Walking Dead's original show. If we kind of think about something that's very dear and near to Scott M. Gimple and something that he has actually been working out a lot in terms of story for The Walking Dead, we can see that it kind of makes sense why he's becoming the new showrunner for Fear the Walking Dead. So the whole Morgan storylines and everything related to Morgan Jones in The Walking Dead is basically written directly by Scott Gimple, and he's basically responsible for all of the storytelling aspects of Morgan Jones' story in The Walking Dead. So now that it was actually revealed that Morgan is going to be crossing over to Fear the Walking Dead, it only makes sense for Scott Gimple to produce and write Morgan's storyline into Fear the Walking Dead, to make sure that not only is the story being told in the right way, but also everything makes sense. He is acting right. He is basically doing everything that Morgan Jones would do in that time frame in which he appears in Fear the Walking Dead, in terms of what he was doing in The Walking Dead's original show. So it only makes sense for Scott Gimple to actually be, taking over this. So in terms of Scott Gimple himself, I think he is only becoming the co-producer of Fear the Walking Dead in order to bring Morgan's storyline or his backstory or whatever it's going to end up being into Fear the Walking Dead. And, he's going to be basically the person that's going to be bridging this gap between The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. Now, that being said, let's jump right into the main 3 kind of possible scenarios in which Morgan Jones could cross over into Fear the Walking Dead. The first one is most unrealistic and I would say the least likely to happen. And that scenario being that we're going to see some sort of crazy time jump in Fear the Walking Dead, and they're going to basically jump forward in time and reach where we are in the Walking Dead's original show right now. So at the end of Season 8, we're going to see Morgan Jones leaving, and he's going to basically be meeting up with the Fear the Walking Dead characters, and he's going to basically continue his story arc in that show. So that basically means that this crossover will not be some sort of backstory for Morgan, but it will be a continuation of Morgan Jones's storyline. So if this ends up happening, there's actually 2 ways in which it could go. The first way it could go is that Morgan could basically travel to where Fear the Walking Dead characters are at this time, either in land or maybe in water. We know that one of the main things with Fear the Walking Dead is how much they utilize the sea aspect of the story, and the story being told in a way that it involves the ocean or the water in some way. So it's definitely possible that Morgan would end up traveling from the ocean into where the Fear the Walking Dead characters are at the moment, which is in the East Coast. Probably near Texas, somewhere close to there. The other alternative is for the Fear the Walking Dead cast to be traveling to where Morgan is, near Virginia in the West Coast. So in that scenario, we're going to see some of the characters from Fear traveling to where Morgan is, and they're going to be meeting up there. So the setting will be very close to the setting that we see in The Walking Dead right now. And if that happens, this could also be basically by land or by water. Now, like I said, this is very unlikely because I just don't see them doing this sort of big time jump into the future in Fear the Walking Dead, especially since we are in a crucial and critical moment in the Fear the Walking Dead story in terms of where we left off last time. You know, what we're going to see from these different characters and how many of these characters are even going to survive. So that's very unlikely. Now, that being said, there is something that Scott Gimple said about this crossover that has me a bit concerned that maybe this is the route that they're going to go. Even though it's unlikely, there's something that Scott Gimple said that kind of gives some sort of support to this theory, which I'll get to at the end of the video. So the next possible scenario is for this crossover to happen sometime between when Rick leaves Morgan to find his family until the moment that him, Michonne, and Carl find Morgan back in that large building with all the traps in the episode Clear. So that's one alternative, and it's the one that makes the most sense. Now, why is that? The reason for this is the time. Time works in their benefit in this case because that time period was like, I would say, a couple months. So they can easily explain how Morgan ended up being in the East Coast, being where the Fear the Walking Dead characters are in this time period. It's easier to explain and it's more realistic. The other alternative, which I would say is the second in terms of how likely it is that this crossover will happen sometime between when Rick, Carl, and Michonne leave Morgan in Clear until Morgan basically meets up with Eastman and goes through his whole all life is precious journey. Now, that time period is very small. It would be fairly difficult for them to explain how he ended up where he was in this time period. So if they're gonna want to do it in a more realistic way, I would say they would probably go with the second scenario, which is that this takes place somewhere in between when Rick leaves Morgan to find his family until he finds him again in Clear. So that being said, there was something that Scott Gimple said in the last Talking Dead episode when this was revealed about this crossover that has me baffled. So Scott Gimple says that Morgan's story arc in Season 8 of The Walking Dead positioned him to have the arc he is going to have in Fear the Walking Dead. So the way I take this quote is that Morgan's storyline and his story arc in Season 8 of The Walking Dead will make his story in this crossover or his story in Fear the Walking Dead more meaningful and will give it more significance. And if that is the case, then one possible support for this would be that, you know, Morgan does leave and go to the East Coast and find the Fear the Walking Dead cast, because his story in Season 8, which would be him leaving, would position him to be in a spot where he would go to the East Coast and find the Fear the Walking Dead cast. However, that being said, that does not make sense because the story just does not work. If he's going to be traveling to the East Coast, then he would basically be meeting up with them at a later time. So, again, in that scenario, we would have to see some sort of time jump. That's the only way that would work if that's going to happen. If that's not the case, if Morgan is not going to be leaving and meeting up with the Fear group, then Scott Gimple's quote just feels very odd and interesting because I have a hard time actually thinking about how it would work in terms of what Scott Gimple said and timeline-wise how it would work. So I want your opinion about this. What do you think Scott Gimple means when he says Morgan's story arc in Season 8 of The Walking Dead positioned him for the arc he's going to have in Fear the Walking Dead? Now, one last thing I want to say before I end this video is that it's very likely for Morgan to actually end up dying in Season 8. And the reason for that is his interview on Talking Dead when he was basically revealing this. Now, there's two ways. One is that they could be misleading us with, him saying all of those things, and it could be just a way to mislead us, and Morgan is not dead, and he will come back for season 9. Him being on Fear the Walking Dead doesn't mean he's not going to be on Walking Dead anymore, but that does not mean that he's not going to leave for a little bit, because of course it seems like he is taking on some of Michonne's comic book arc in terms of leaving for a little bit. So that's definitely still possible. He could be on Fear but also leave at the same time. But those two would not have anything to do with each other. They would be two separate things. Now, if they're not actually misleading us and Lenny James actually did unintentionally spoil his death in season 8, then I feel like they tried to help Fear, but at the same time, they're basically jeopardizing the story for season 8, because now everyone knows Morgan is going to die. And if we know that, there might be other crucial parts of the story that we might actually be able to predict based on that. So I'm very interested in knowing, how they're going to do this crossover, and whether Morgan actually dies in season 8, and whether Lenny James unintentionally spoiled Morgan's death in season 8. That being said, I want to know everybody's opinions about this. What do you think about this crossover? How do you think it's going to work? And what are your overall expectations about this crossover? That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.